Hey everyone, so today's topic is going to be, am I trans enough? So, what I mean by that is this is a concept that frequently comes up, especially when people are still in the closet or very early in their transition. Sometimes it comes up where somebody's comparing themselves to other trans people out there, especially trans individuals that may be much further along, so to speak, in their transition. Um, and people might compare themselves directly to that. So it might be like me 3 years ago when I was still in the closet, very early in my transitioning to my life to living my life as a woman, looking at trans women who have been on hormone replacement therapy for 5 or more years. And yeah, it could be like a night and day difference. And situations like that could make me think like, oh, maybe that's not my goal for transitioning. So, am I actually trans? And I think it's important to ask yourself, um, does your gender identity align with the sex you're assigned at birth? If not, then I think it's safe to say that you're probably trans. Your transition pathway is gonna look different than anybody else's. Everybody's transition is unique. Um, so it's not always healthy to compare like your transition goals directly to someone else, at least not in terms of like determining whether or not your transition goals are valid. Because it's about checking in to see like, okay, identify as trans. Where where do I want to go with my transition? Are my goals to just change my name and be happy with that? My goal is to change my name and my gender marker and be happy with that? Are my goals to extend further and also change my gender expression but not undergo any medical transitioning? Or do I want to go on hormones but no surgery? Or do everything plus surgery? And, spoiler alert, any and all of those pathways are completely valid. Anywhere in between, anything I didn't mention even, it's completely valid. Um, and this is not my personal experience since I'm a binary trans woman, but I know there can be a lot more gender policing and a lot more, validation or invalidation of trans identities in, the non-binary community, because those identities can be very diverse and often are very diverse. um, in terms of like identifying as a combination of male and female or somewhere outside the gender binary altogether, a fluidity of gender or no gender or a third gender. But that's not something I want to cover very much because that's not my experience. But that's something I just want to kind of put out there for people to think about. There are plenty of other YouTubers out there who are non-binary that could speak to this much better than I ever could, because their lived experience, is one of being a non-binary individual. Um, but anyways, um, being trans enough is kind of this, in my opinion, a toxic terminology, because it can be seen as being kind of gatekeepery in a sense of like, you know, people might be convinced that I am not really trans, but they're thinking that because their transition looks different than all of their friends' transitions or people online that are transitioning. So therefore, they don't deserve to be called trans, or they don't deserve to have access to whatever interventions they need to fully realize their gender identity in the outward world. Um, Another subject entirely, but that is kind of a practice that's used a lot in like health insurance and access to hormones and surgery. It's kind of like proving your transness, having to see like a mental health provider to get a letter for hormones, or having to see multiple mental health providers to get letters for, sex reassignment surgery. And it's kind of like this process where you have to prove to the surgeons and often prove to your insurance company too, if you want to get any sort of coverage, that like, okay, I'm trans enough, so I deserve this surgery. It's medically necessary. Instead of just trusting that trans people know their experiences and trusting that, you know, they have a better sense of their own gender identity than anyone else does. I mean, gender comes from within. So I think it's safe to assume that someone's own concept of their gender, they understand their own concept better than anyone else in the world. But kind of the point here is, being trans enough, I don't really think that's a thing. If you're trans, you're trans. And your transition pathway is valid regardless of how simple or complex it may be. I mean, transitioning in itself is not a simple process regardless of what that looks like to you. But, regardless of how many steps there are, regardless of how you want to appear in the world, regardless of whether or not you're doing medical intervention, that's all valid. If you are trans, you are trans. There's no such thing as being, not trans enough or too trans or anything like that. So it's basically like, ask yourself these questions. Do you identify as trans? Yes, then you are trans enough. Are you taking steps needed for you to satisfy your own personal transition goals? Goals that come from within and not from anyone else in the world. If you're taking the steps needed for you personally in your transition, then yes, you are trans enough. It's just all about being in tune with who you are and how you identify in terms of your trans identity. So if somebody tells you that you're not trans enough, fuck them. They don't know what they're talking about. Embrace who you are, love who you are, and, all trans identities are valid. So that's pretty much all I'm going to cover today. I just wanted to thank the few subscribers I have now. If anybody is new here today, please subscribe, please like this video, please share. I'm planning on putting out at least 1 or 2 videos a week about, aspects about my transition or more general trans awareness stuff like this video today, and eventually some maybe personal growth and self-love type stuff as well that's not necessarily specifically trans related. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much for watching.